Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Now usually on this show we build fun and inexpensive focused Commander decks on a $25 budget. But today we're going to do a Commander Quick Take. On episodes like these, I give you my initial take on newly spoiled commanders from an upcoming set. For each commander, I'm going to talk about a potential direction to take them. And I'm also going to give you some initial cards that I'm considering for that build. Now I might not be able to get to every single new commander at once, but I will get to them eventually. And as always, prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCG Player. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. I just want to give a quick disclaimer before we jump into this. On episodes like these, they are just initial quick takes. These commanders are just as new to me as they are to you. And because of that, I don't have any finalized decks built for these commanders. So the direction that I initially take with one of these commanders might not be the same direction that I take them in a deck tech. And because of that, some of the cards I'm going to mention might not be in those decks either. But now that we're on the same page, let's get into it. My first commander quick take is going to be on Massacre Girl. Massacre Girl is a 4/4 human assassin with menace that costs 3 black. When she enters the battlefield, each other creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Whenever a creature dies this turn, each creature other than Massacre Girl gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Since this effect stacks on itself, this can get out of hand very quickly. As long as there are a few small creatures out there, this is pretty much going to be a board wipe every single time she comes into play. And always having access to a board wipe from the command zone is a very powerful thing. So in my opinion, the most effective direction for this deck is a control style build. We want to build around that board wipe, making sure that it happens and making sure that we benefit from it. The first part about this effect is to make sure that there are small creatures on the board. Again, the more creatures that die, the more times that effect is going to stack and build on itself. So we're going to be running something like Genesis Chamber, which says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, if Genesis Chamber is untapped, that creature's controller creates a 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature token. Genesis Chamber essentially forces our opponents to create small creature tokens every single time they put a non-token creature into play. This allows Massacre Girl's ability to more easily stack so she can kill more and more creatures. And on top of that, when she comes into play, we get to create one as well, so that's just going to add to it. So another card that we can include for this part of the strategy is a Crow and Horse. It's a 0/4 defender that costs 4, and it says when it enters the battlefield, an opponent gains control of it. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent creates a 1/1 white soldier creature token. So essentially we give this to one of our opponents, and at the beginning of their upkeep, they're going to make everyone else create a 1/1 soldier creature token. Unlike Genesis Chamber, this card isn't dependent on our opponents actually casting any creatures. But since it's also a creature itself, it's also vulnerable to being killed by Massacre Girl. But if this can just last either 1 or 2 times around the table, it's going to have done its job. And finally, there's Infernal Genesis, which is an enchantment that says, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. Then they create X 1/1 black minion creature tokens, where X is that card's converted mana cost. This is a fantastic way to essentially force all players to put small creatures into play. Now this does whiff whenever it hits a land, but most of the time it's not going to be a land that's revealed. Again, the point of these cards though is to get as many small creatures out on the battlefield, especially ones under our opponent's control. The next part of the strategy is to benefit off of those creatures dying. So something like Shadows of the Past is going to help us because it's going to let us scry every single time one of those creatures dies. With a massive amount of creatures that are going to die at once, we can pretty much dig until we find the right card that we need next. And then there's Dingus Staff, which says whenever a creature dies, Dingus Staff deals 2 damage to that creature's controller. This one we are going to have to be a little more careful with because again, some of our token producers actually create us tokens too. But with this deck, we're not going to be playing a lot of creatures, so our opponents are generally going to have more creatures than us. With the right setup and if we can time this right, we can knock out all of our opponents at once. And finally, there's Grave Betrayal, which says whenever a creature you don't control dies, return to the battlefield under your control with an additional +1/+1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. That creature is a black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. This card is incredibly good in this deck. Whenever we wipe the board with this in play, we're going to gain control of all of our opponent's non-token creatures. If our opponents don't deal with Grave Betrayal, it's going to be very hard for them to win because we can just keep wiping the board with our commander. Since our commander already starts off at 5 mana though, casting her over and over again from the command zone can get expensive. So another part of our strategy is going to be to find some ways to get around that. We can pay 2 and sacrifice Voyager Staff to exile our commander and bring her back at the beginning of the next end step. This is a very cheap and effective way for us to get her into the battlefield trigger again. And then there's Undying Evil, which is going to give her Undying until end of turn. So if she's ever about to die, we can just use this to get her right back. We're also going to be running some sacrifice outlets in this deck so we can sacrifice her and so we can sacrifice tokens ahead of time if we need to. And finally there's Blood Clock, which says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player returns a permanent they control to their hand unless they pay 2 life. This is a great repeatable way for us to get our commander back to our hand. So as long as this and our commander stick around, we're guaranteed to be able to cast her for 5 mana each time. And a 5 mana repeatable board wipe can be really oppressive. Massacre Girl seems like a very unique commander to build around with a strategy that not everyone's going to see coming. But with that, this first quick take is over, so let's move on to the second one. Our second quick take is going to be on Neheb. Neheb Dreadhorde Champion is a 5/4 zombie minotaur warrior with trample that costs 2 red. It has whenever it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you may discard any number of cards. If you do, draw that many cards and add that much red. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. This is a very interesting effect, and you can probably take this deck in a lot of different directions. Not only does this commander essentially let you wheel, but it also adds a lot of mana to your mana pool. But it does depend on actually hitting a player or planeswalker to get that effect. So the direction that I would take this commander is a Voltron style build. First off, I would build around that damage trigger to make sure that he's getting that damage in and that we're getting the most benefit from it. So in this deck, I'd run equipment like Prowler's Helm, which essentially makes him unblockable. Neheb does have trample, but we want to make sure that we can actually get that damage in so that we can guarantee that we get that effect. We'd also want to abuse that effect when we can, so we'd run things like Fire Shrieker and Blood Mist. Both of these are great ways to give Neheb double strike. Because Neheb's effect triggers when it hits, if we can make him hit twice, we're going to get double that effect. This means that we can discard and draw twice as many cards and produce twice as much mana. We can make this effect even more brutal by adding in our next part of the strategy, which revolves around additional combat steps. The extra mana that's produced can help us cast something like Relentless Assault. It allows us to untap all creatures that attack this turn and essentially gives us another combat phase. So even if Neheb doesn't have double strike, this is still going to allow us to get 2 hits in a turn. But if he does have double strike, this allows us to get in 4. Something like Seize the Day can be even more effective. It essentially does the same thing, but only allows us to untap 1 creature. That really isn't a negative for this deck though, because this deck is built around Neheb. The best part about this card though is it has flashback, so we can do it again. If we're set up correctly, this allows us to get in a ton of damage with Neheb. And it's even possible to go infinite with something like Hellkite Charger. It's a 5/5 with flying and haste, and it says when Hellkite Charger attacks, you may pay 5 red. If you do, untap all attacking creatures, and after this phase, there's an initial combat phase. So if we're able to discard 7 cards each time, we can produce that 7 mana that we need to keep doing this over and over again. And if Neheb has double strike, we don't even need 7 cards in hand to make this happen. Another way that we can finish off our opponents is mass land destruction. As long as Neheb's on the battlefield and can get through, we can produce mana with him. So blowing up all the lands can shut down our opponents, and we're going to be just fine. So we'll cast something like Epicenter, which is going to make all players sacrifice all lands if we have Threshold. This deck is going to discard a ton of cards, so we're pretty much always going to have Threshold when we need it. And then we can cycle Decree of Annihilation to destroy all lands. What makes this effect especially devastating to our opponents is that it can't be countered since we're cycling it. And finally, we're going to run some cards like Shreds of Sanity. This allows us to get back an extra combat spell or one of our land destruction spells if we need it. With the right setup, once this deck gets going, it can be very hard for our opponents to stop. But now it's time for us to move on to our final quick take. Our third and final quick take is going to be on the new Krenko. Krenko Tin Street Kingpin is a 1/2 goblin that costs 2 and a red. Whenever it attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it, then create a number of 1/1 red goblin creature tokens equal to Krenko's power. This is similar to the other Krenko where it can create a ton of goblins at once, but it does require an attack. So the direction that I would take this deck is a tribal style build that's centered around creating a ton of tokens with Krenko. So the first part of our strategy is going to revolve around keeping Krenko safe while creating more tokens. We can run a card like Madcap Skills to give him some evasion while also pumping him. If we get this on Krenko early, even with our first swing, we're going to be creating 5 tokens. But again, the most important thing, especially early on, is keeping Krenko alive, so even something as simple as Cobbled Wings can come in really handy. And then Kite Sail might take more to equip, but it's also going to give us an extra token each time. The more times that we can attack with Krenko and the more powerful that we can make him, the more tokens we're going to get. With all these tokens, we also want to run some Goblin synergies to make them even more of a threat. So a card like Goblin King is going to give all other goblins +1/+1 in Mountain Walk. Not only does this help our token army, but it also helps Krenko. And then there's Goblin Lookout, which has tap, sacrifice a goblin, all goblins get +2/+0 until end of turn. So although we have to lose 1 goblin, we're actually going to be gaining 2 once we attack with Krenko. And without any other effects, this essentially triples the amount of damage that our other goblins put out. And finally, an aura like Bravado can be an absolute bomb in this deck. It's going to give Krenko +1/+1 for each other creature we control. This can quickly make Krenko into an unstoppable force that can create a ton of tokens at once. Essentially, every single time we attack with Krenko, we're going to get more than double the amount of goblins that we already have. With just a few swings with this on, we can easily overwhelm our opponents with our goblin army. And to finish this game off even further, we can run something like Relentless Assault. This lets our army attack again and allows Krenko to create even more goblins in our turn. But we can also use something like Impact Tremors to finish off our opponents. It has whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, Impact Tremors deals 1 damage to each opponent. With the number of tokens that Krenko can make in 1 turn, this can deal a ton of damage to all of our opponents. And then Outpost Siege can hurt our opponents whenever one of our creatures dies. It has whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, Outpost Siege deals 1 damage to our creature or player. With this in play, at a certain point, our opponents can't even wrath the board without getting killed. This Krenko is similar to the last one, but these decks are definitely going to have their differences. And with that, this show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you guys think about this episode, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying a deck or just individual cards, make sure to use our link in the description. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCG Player, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel, then check out some of our other episodes on budget deck techs, break the bank episodes, commander topics, and creators quarters episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.